Well, welcome. It's my pleasure to be here today with Darryl De Marzio, a professor at the University of Scranton. My name is Margarita Mooney. I am a professor at Princeton Theological Seminary and founder and executive director of Scala Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to classical liberal arts education. And through my teaching at Princeton Theological Seminary and through Scala, I have become extremely interested in what does it mean to renew a vision of education today, founded in the idea that we are all made in the image of God, and there's certain content that shapes our minds and helps us discover our own vocations in the world. I'm particularly delighted to welcome Professor De Marzio today because of your unique background, and I'll have you tell us a little bit about that in a moment. But you're someone keenly interested in education who also teaches in philosophy. And specifically today, I've asked you to come to speak about the call to teach. What does it mean to think of teaching as a vocation? And I was so excited to invite you to give this talk and to read the readings that you suggested I read in advance, which I shared with my students and some friends, because I've loved all of my teacher training that I had as a graduate student at Princeton University and as a faculty at University of North Carolina, at Chapel Hill, later at Yale University, now here in Princeton Theological Seminary. But never once did my teacher training raise the questions that we're going to raise today. What does it mean to see teaching as a vocation? So if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit yourself, honestly, before we get into your higher ed credentials, tell us about your own educational background in K to 12, and then how that led into what you do now in higher ed.
Okay, so and when you say K to 12, you mean my experience?
Yeah, like kind of schooling you had, yeah.
Yeah, so I grew up a city kid in Paterson, New Jersey, in a kind of Italian-American neighborhood. Went through public school, K through 8. And then I saw Dead Poets Society and wanted to go to a boarding school. So I pushed, my parents and teachers and advisors, and sort of helped me realize this dream, and ended up going to Blair Academy in Blairstown, New Jersey. And I was a 4-year boarding student there. Was always drawn to the humanities, whether that was the study of literature, history, and always had a kind of philosophical orientation, I guess you could say, to the world. And so when I looked at colleges, I wanted a small liberal arts college close to home, and that was Drew University in Madison, New Jersey, I guess not too far from Princeton. And I was a philosophy major there. And like many philosophy majors, when it's time to graduate, you have that sort of uh-oh moment, well, what am I going to do with this? And I really didn't prepare myself for certain avenues like graduate school or law school or anything like that. So I went to a professor of mine and sought counsel about, what to do upon graduation. And he recommended a unique program at Montclair State University, which was essentially my backyard where I was living at the time. Called the Institute for the Advancement of Philosophy for Children. And the goal of that institute was to develop curriculum and teaching methods to bring philosophical study to young children, elementary school children. And so I basically just went to the institute and said, what could I do? How can I be a part of this? And so I enrolled in Montclair State as a elementary teacher education major, but all the while really learning the ropes at the Institute. And I began to participate in a variety of different roles, engaging in teacher training throughout New Jersey, helping teachers implement the philosophical curriculum that the Institute was developing. And at this time, they offered me, once I finished my master's in teaching, They offered me a part-time position as a director of field services, where I would go into schools and promote the Philosophy for Children program. But I was also teaching as an adjunct at Montclair State philosophy of education. And the philosophy of education courses were specifically for teachers, or better yet, specifically for those enrolled in teacher education. So in teaching philosophy of education, I was faced with the question, why do teachers need philosophy? And that really was the first moment of being, I guess you can say, existentially, but also professionally invested in this question. Why should teachers study philosophy? What does it have to do with their practice? Now, that led me to go to Teachers College, Columbia University, where I pursued a PhD in philosophy and education. And that is where I encountered the teaching and work of both David Hanson and Chris Higgins. So in suggesting those readings to you for today, I was suggesting the work of two professor mentors and now colleagues. But my initial foray into the question of, why should teachers study philosophy was confronting the, I guess you could say, the received answer or the conventional answer, which is that teachers should study philosophy, but also other humanistic disciplines such as history, sociology, even to a certain extent, political science and things like that, because, and certainly psychology, because that would serve as a kind of foundational knowledge base upon which teachers could then build their practical know-how. And that seemed to serve me as a teacher of philosophy of education for a while. But then I encountered a certain understanding of philosophy, which I picked up when reading two philosophers, both French 20th century philosophers, Pierre Hadot and Michel Foucault, who interpreted particularly ancient philosophy not as contributing to, what I referred to earlier as a kind of knowledge base, right? In other words, philosophy wasn't, the sole purpose of philosophy in this understanding of ancient philosophy was not the pursuit of knowledge, but rather it was the pursuit of what at least Michel Foucault referred to as the care of the self. Philosophy was part and parcel of the task of self-formation, self-perfection, in the words of Maritain, and self-fulfillment, in the words of Maritain. So then, when I had that understanding of philosophy, I then posed the question, well, what would this mean for teacher education? In other words, what if teachers studied philosophy not so much as trying to gain a storehouse of knowledge, principles, and theories, but really studied philosophy as a way in which they could achieve a kind of fulfillment through the work of teaching, achieve a flourishing, in the words of Chris Higgins, through teaching. So that's really where I came to this question or theme of the vocation of teaching. Through the study of philosophy as itself a kind of vocational task or a project of the human being's quest for fulfillment.
Wow, that was fascinating. Y'all can hear me now, right? Okay.
Yeah.
That was fascinating. Okay, so you posed this kind of very basic question. Why do teachers need to know philosophy? And if I understood you correctly, you said that the conventional answer is that philosophy is a good basis for other kinds of knowledge. And that a pivotal moment for you was reading thinkers like Hadot and Foucault, who said that no, knowing philosophy was part of care of the self or self-development. And so you transformed your understanding of the role of philosophy in teacher preparation because philosophy helps teachers fulfill their own vocation as human beings, you could say. Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah.
That's so interesting. So then could we go then maybe a little deeper? So then it seems to me that in your writing that I've seen and in the teaching that you do, I mean, I'm absolutely fascinated by the class that you teach. I believe it's at Teachers College in the summer on this topic of teaching as a vocation. And when I looked at the syllabus, it looks like you move people through the history of how different philosophers have thought about education, Socrates,
Yes.
Rousseau, and then you bring in some of these sources, Foucault. I don't believe you have Maritain on there, though maybe one day you will.
No, I was very inspired by
Okay, it's okay. I'm
reading
just
the
making a joke. You know, Emerson.
Mhm.
And so you sort of review the kind of main debates, really different perspectives on what does it mean for teaching as a vocation, which come back to this understanding of the relationship of philosophy to knowledge,
Right.
and the relationship of philosophy to the self.
Right.
So today I wanted to focus on two authors that you have introduced to me. Thank you so much, David Hanson and Chris Higgins, who you said were your mentors, your colleagues, your inspiration.
Right.
So I wondered if maybe we start first. I mean, which one should we start with first? It seems to me maybe Hanson, because he starts off talking about, well, I mean, it seems so obvious what he says in his book that, you know, teaching is both an individual and a social calling. It's a service to others and it's a fulfillment of self. So this seems so obvious, but why is this a unique or important thing to say?
Well, I think there are a few reasons why it's unique and important. Number one is because even though it's obvious, it still gets lost. And particularly the point gets lost in research on teaching. Which is why Hanson spends a good deal of time in that chapter, but also throughout his early work on teaching as a vocation, sort of emphasizing or better yet, bringing into play what he would call the language of vocation, right? We don't really we don't discuss teaching, but we also don't research teaching insofar as it, in a sense, flows back to the teacher. And I use that notion of flowing back to the teacher because I think I picked it up from Maritain in this reading, where he basically early on discusses, and this is Maritain, discusses that we can't say that education is only about the social human being, right? Or cultivating the social life of the human being. Or that education can be, simply about promoting the common good. That can't be the primary aim, but it is an important aim because in doing so, the individual good is supported by and with and through the common good, right? So I think similarly, something can be said about teaching, that yes, teaching, we might even say primarily is about the cultivation of the student, right? Meeting the needs of the student, in the language of Higgins, tending to the growth or the welfare of the student. But in doing so, we have to pay attention of how the teacher is shaped or formed in that way, for better or worse, right? I mean, sometimes we can, note how teaching affects teachers because of institutional reasons, economic reasons, what have you, in a negative sense, or that there are negative effects, but there are also positive effects, certainly. Teachers continue to describe teaching in the terms of vocation insofar as they are fulfilled, moved, transformed by the work, by the encounters with students, by their exploration of curriculum, et cetera, et cetera. The problem is that we just don't really talk about teaching in that way, right? We don't talk about teaching in the terms of the teacher. We talk about and research teaching primarily in the terms of the student. Just think of a contemporary syllabus in which, you'll see by the end of this course, students will be able to achieve these learning outcomes, objectives, et cetera, et cetera. Well, we don't really talk about, by the end of this course, the teacher will be able to, or will see, or experience, or feel. So I just think opening up the language of vocation and making that available for teachers, but also educational researchers, philosophers, et cetera, is very, very important. And that's something that Hansen has achieved, but also contributed, I think.
That's really fascinating. I never would have thought of it in those terms had you not explained it. But in the field of sociology where I once worked, most sociology of education is actually about it's most research about education is about educational method and student outcomes, right?
Yes.
And there's not a body of scholarship that studies the development of the teacher over time. I'd never heard of such a thing until you brought it to my attention. But
and Margarita, if I can just add, you sort of see that get played out in teacher education, right? So teacher education is mainly about, and specifically what I was saying before about the study of philosophy for teachers, that is a foundational sort of study, right? It's that upon which you build your experiential knowledge, your methodological knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. But what about the study of philosophy being an ongoing part of a teacher's development, not just a foundational one? So that's where I think, that's what I, in a sense, try to do with my teaching and my work, is to try to make not only philosophy as a discipline, but humanistic study, the liberal arts available for teachers, not just in terms of being a foundation upon which they can apply practical knowledge, but as in a sense, a lifelong pursuit. So that's in reading Maritain, I was, very simpatico with education at the crossroads, for sure.
Well, I think what you identified in Maritain that resonates with what you do and what I see as well in Higgins, I think Maritain uses this word, the dynamism of education, right? So as you described it, teachers put themselves into their art, their teaching, but then what happens in the classroom flows back into them and continues to shape them. And what their encounter with the students' ideas, frankly, the encounter with students' personalities has been very educational to me. The students who are participating in my class this semester are coming from contexts I have no personal knowledge of, but it makes me think differently. And I think that's why, as you said, this term vocation became really important to Higgins and Hansen, but also to you. And I thought it was important that Hansen says that a vocation is something that we commit ourselves to, and in the act of doing shapes us over time. So that's why he uses the word vocation. It's not a task that you just accomplish and there's an outcome. And it's not just a role that you fulfill that somebody else could fulfill tomorrow. And not that those kinds of things we all do aren't important, right? Like somebody else could take my trash out. That'd be fine with me. But that the vocation is something that shapes your fundamental commitments and shapes who you are. So it's a kind of doing that develops your being.
Yes, indeed. And it's also a kind of duty, a doing that you participate in such a way that you can place your own personal stamp on it, right? So, which is why Hansen spends a good deal of time talking about the relationship between the practitioner and the practice. That teaching, and more, we're sort of understanding teaching as a kind of function and the teacher as a mere functionary rather than a practitioner in a long-standing practice with goods that are internal to it, so that the teacher is, in taking up teaching, is not only receiving all of the rewards that come from teaching, but also has an opportunity to provide or bring their own sort of personal mark to the work itself. It seems that particularly in teacher education, we're looking for a kind of we're standardizing teaching to such an extent that we're looking for, and I often see young teachers seek this out, right? This sort of standardized toolkit that they could, just bring to the job so that they can meet goals, meet objectives, meet outcomes, and really not go through or risk the adventure, right, of finding, this sounds corny and cliche, but truly finding oneself or one's, stamp in the work and through the work.
Yeah. Well, what you're describing there, moving from a vocation, the idea of teaching as a vocation, to idea as the teacher as a functionary, I also think Hansen touches on this. This has happened to a lot of professions. He mentions ministers, of which I teach future ministers at Princeton Theological Seminary. He mentions doctors, right? Maybe even athletic coaches we could put in there. And I've been listening to a popular Catholic writer by the name of Matthew Kelly, who was a motivational speaker and executive coach, and then became this popular Catholic speaker. And he has this book called Perfectly Yourself. And it's really about the loss of kind of purpose animating the life choices that we make. And I think the risk then becomes that teaching, which is supposed to be, as you just said, this wonderful, risky adventure of finding oneself. You were inspired by Dead Poets Society, right?
Yeah.
That the encounter with these great books and this motivating teacher and these other people. And Kelly says this too, like that kind of seeking is a really deep, challenging process to engage in. And people are looking for it. And if they don't get it in their day-to-day job, they're going to look for it somewhere else. So I wonder kind of, what do you say? Because you've thought about this. When I read Hansen, I thought, it seemed to me, and I don't know if you would agree, that Hansen was saying that teachers can practice the art of teaching as a vocation, even in a setting that isn't necessarily set up to do that, right? Because most K-12 teachers in public schools, they will be measured by student outcomes and quantitative measures. So would you say that this vision of teaching as a vocation is possible in the current structures?
Right. And I think now we're sort of pointing to a sort of debate, I think, between Higgins and Hansen, where I think you're right that Hansen and, I actually have a sort of anecdote to this point, which is, so my background is in philosophy. I teach philosophy of education. I also teach courses in educational psychology, mainly educational theory courses. But at the University of Scranton, I'm housed in an education department and in a teacher education program. And in terms of how we're evaluated as faculty, particularly when I was, tenure track, it was often frustrating to me because many of my colleagues, both in the education department, but also in the college in which I am in, which is very much a professional college, right? Writing essays on Plato and Foucault and things like that, there just wasn't a recognition of what I was doing. So I went to my provost and, sort of expressed my frustration about, as I put it, being homeless in the house of intellect, right? I'm not really, I don't have a home where I am in an education department. And he basically said, this was my provost at the time, Well, just be a philosopher in an education department. Like what's the big deal? I don't, why do you have to be a philosopher in a philosophy department and a education person in an education department? Just be the sort of, the strange one or the stranger in this place that you're in. And even though it wasn't what I wanted to hear, it ended up being, I think, something that became my own sort of unique vocation within the institution that I'm in. And I think that's something like Hanson's point, that regardless of, although, in things like institutional constraints and injustices and things like that need to be addressed and called out and worked upon, but that one can still find one's calling within those constraints or given those conditions. And now Higgins makes, I think, a good deal of how institutional constraints have contributed to a lot of the sort of the prevailing norms of selflessness, right? Whether it's the lack of economic resources, the fact that historically teaching has been understood in a kind of gendered way, and therefore these particular demands and expectations of being selfless have been attached to the work of teaching. Higgins also uses a passage from the poet Rilke in his letters to a young poet, where the military officer Franz Kappes, who the poet Rilke is having this exchange of letters with, Franz, even though he's going to this military academy and he's very unhappy about, he wants to be a poet, right? He has this calling to be a poet. By the end of their exchange of letters, Rilke says, well, just be a poet military commander, basically. In other words, you could have this poetic disposition, you could have this poetic calling, regardless of the institutional environmental conditions that you find yourself in. So I think that's precisely right.
Mm-hmm. I'm really encouraged to hear you say that. Thank you. Because when I give talks on this vision, people often will respond, well, most teachers are not in institutions that support this vision. It seems like in your case, and fortunately in my case, because you're at University of Scranton, which is a Catholic college and it's a Jesuit college. So it sounds like your leader is still inspired by the Catholic and Jesuit tradition of the integration of knowledge, right? And that's been my fortunate move out of, Princeton University, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Yale University. The disciplinary boundaries were pretty rigid. And I ended up in a Christian school at Princeton Theological Seminary, and they love it that I teach in the same class psychology and philosophy. They think that's great. So we have at least the mission of a school that we can appeal to back us up. But a lot of people don't. But yet, the people in this class, the people I've taught at Princeton Theological Seminary, people like yourself who went to public schools in Patterson or public schools in rural United States, you encounter one teacher who teaches brilliantly as a vocation, and it can open up an entire world. And what I say, because I am a sociologist, and I think like Hanson, I'm very aware of the barriers, right? The economic barriers, the prejudices, the institutional blockages of this vision of education. It's not that those don't matter. I would just say that addressing the structural problems in education requires one strategy, but everybody can live out this vocation. And if you do this, you will impact people. I'm not saying that an individual teacher is going to change the New York City public school system or any school system and somehow make it more just for everybody. I'm not saying that. That would require a long-term strategy. But we should not discount the tremendous transformative impact that teachers working against the stream have in these contexts, and that eventually can feed into the structural change. That's what I think.
Yeah. And I would I would welcome comments from those who hear what you said, and I agree with you. Those who think we need to be sort of much more activist in our approach, right? So in other words, not resign ourselves to, you know, not resign ourselves to sort of navigating, you know, the system, so that we can find little niches and pockets in which we can engage in our practice, but that the task really is a sort of transformation of the system itself. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, how do you perhaps hold on to this idea that, you know, you're going to live out your vocation and that somehow that's going to build up to a larger impact? And I think that's part of the reason I founded Scala, and it's part of the reason you and I have connected, and it's part of the reason I do these things, because I think the more people hear stories, I mean, I call this series of dialogues that you're a part of, I call it Exemplary Educators. And I'm trying to highlight exemplary educators doing this work. Many of them do end up impacting their institution or their school, but it may be a long-term strategy. It may not be a vote at a particular meeting. And I think that if I could bring us to Higgins for a moment, there was so much there that I liked, but I think in terms of motivating the people listening to this to live out this vision, I also wanted to posit a little bit the risk of this vision, right? And I think Higgins, there was a lot of it I liked, but I have to tell you, the one part that really spoke to me was his story of the burnout that can occur from people who go into teaching as this selfless act. And he has these levels where he talks about how there are people who go into teaching thinking, I'm going to give myself entirely to this profession, and I'm going to be the saint, right? The superhero, the self-sacrificing monger. And then over time, they get a little burnout, and then they get more burnout. And then after a while, they become resentful at how little they are appreciated by their superiors and by their students. And they become, and that resentment takes itself out. So the personal burnout can actually become anger and a desire to control. And look, I'm saying that because I've struggled with those feelings as a person who loves teaching. It's frustrating to me when students aren't motivated, or frankly, when I know they're lying, or, you know, when they've committed plagiarism, you know. And so that really spoke to me, that burnout isn't only, I do so much of a good thing that I'm so tired. I mean, he actually says, would that teachers who are burned out left the system. The problem is when teachers who are burned out don't leave the system and they start harming their students. You know? So tell us a little bit then about Higgins and how he overlaps with Hansen, but also, you know, draws out additional aspects, in particular around what goes wrong. Like, what are the potential pitfalls about seeing teaching as a vocation and a selfless act?
Yeah. So I think Higgins, and I just have to say that, and certainly I'm partial because, you know, these two folks were, you know, teachers and influenced me in several ways. But I have to say that these two books, The Call to Teach by Hansen and The Good Life of Teaching by Higgins, you know, in my own small academic universe, like, these are, you know, great books. And rarely in the field of philosophy of education do we pay significant enough attention to the contribution that fellow philosophers of education make. And what I mean by that is, you know, philosophers of education tend to draw from the great tradition of philosophy, you know, Plato, Rousseau, Dewey, et cetera, and really focus their attention and their commentary and their study on, you know, sort of the main philosophical works in the field. But I've made it a sort of, or I've sort of made it a kind of new commitment to really begin to say, hey, let's take a look at some of the great contributions that are made in our very small field, and let's continue our discussion, you know, sort of within that domain. So I'm really happy that we're doing this today. but I think Higgins's work is masterful and important in so many ways, primarily because he brings up this problem of sacrifice in teaching, and the problem that you mentioned, Margarita, of not only burnout, but what Higgins describes as burn in. Now, I still don't know if I'm all in though, because and how can I sort of enter my potential criticism of Higgins? Well, I'll put it this way. When I was teaching, and here now I'm going back to that story I was telling about when I was an adjunct professor at Montclair State teaching philosophy of education. And I really began that in the early 2000s. And I would say in the year and a half following the events of September 11th, I saw more and more people, adults, right, professionals entering teacher education. In other words, leaving their work, their careers, their professions, and wanting to become teachers. And when I, whether it was in reading their papers or in talking to them in class, out of class, there was this sense that that they had spent their lives, or their professional lives, let's say, pursuing their own pleasures, their own desires, their own sense of that the good life was somehow about achieving and climbing up a kind of corporate ladder and things of this sort. And then after 9/11, something sort of changed in them. And the question of how should I live was either posed again, or posed for the first time, or posed in a different way. And many responded with the answer, teaching, right? I want to teach. I want to contribute to the lives of others. I want to contribute to society. I want to contribute to the world. In other words, there seemed to be less focus on the question of, what do I want, or, what is my project, and more so, how can I participate in the projects of others? So my sense is that, there is still something important about the call to teach and the call to be willing to be of service, for sure, but also that there is a important sense that teaching does have something to do with sacrificing oneself so that others may flourish, and that the answer to the question, what is the good life, or what is it worthwhile to become, has to do with that. Later on in Higgins, he talks about the psychologist Jessica Benjamin, and I think it's an important argument that that one cannot, the dynamics of recognition, right? That one can't be in a healthy relationship if one is a hollowed out self with no project, no desires, no goals, no ego even, because the other will not recognize you as a robust self, right? And this, Benjamin focuses primarily on the mother-child relationship, and that it's not healthy for the child if the mother is completely selfless, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, I think there's also a story about those who become parents and who realize, oh my goodness, I didn't realize life was worth living until I had the responsibility of being for someone else. And so I think there's something about teaching as presenting people with the opportunity precisely to renounce themselves in order to live the good life. And I don't think Higgins is completely on board with that. But I'm speaking to a bunch of theologians and MDiv students, so I think you probably need to talk to me about that.
Well, we should open it up to questions in just a moment, but let me say I've been thinking a lot about this precisely because we were going to have this dialogue today, and I would like to propose a line of thinking that maybe can help us. I'm not entirely sure that I'm correct, but I'm going to just think out loud here. So I think what I hear is that you share the critique that teaching can't be purely self-sacrifice, that
Right.
there's, as in the language of Higgins and Hansen, there's a self-fulfillment that comes, but maybe also having seen, you know, some of your work about the transformation of the self, maybe a term that comes to mind is maybe it's not just about self-sacrifice, it's about self-gift, right?
Mm.
And maybe the word self-gift gets at, and maybe it's not perfect, but to me, what it expresses, and maybe what you're trying to express, or what I'm trying to express, is that one can be a teacher and in some ways be a master of a lot of knowledge, and frankly, a lot of master of a classroom technique. But there's a way to encounter another person where there's an openness to that person. And you see the student, even if they're many years younger than you or don't know your specialty, you see them as bringing a gift to you in themselves, right? So there's a receptivity to another person. And that, for me as a teacher, requires a denial of self, in a sense, a sacrifice of self to truly be open to somebody else. Because believe me, it is a little bit of a power trip to be up there in front of the classroom and you know so much and you know they're going to get graded at the end of the semester and there's a tendency to want to project yourself onto students. And I think the language of self-gift retains the idea that you bring something to the relationship, but they're bringing something too. And the best teachers I've ever met are people who are masters of their subject, but they have this openness to your ideas and a willingness to listen.
And is that precisely because of that self-mastery, or better yet, that mastery of knowledge? In other words, you know, my project of learning, of gaining knowledge is so vital to me that I am open to your ideas, because it informs, improves, or is part of my own project, let's say.
I think so. I mean, I would like to think that, as you said, you know, if you were to interview teachers who've been teaching for 20 or 30 years about why they love teaching, right? I'm a sociologist. We ask these open-ended questions, you know, why do you love teaching? What were your best moments? For me, my best moments are when 3 or 4 years after I've taught somebody, I get an email and they say, I just want to tell you that the class I took with you on economic sociology was really pivotal in my decision to become, you know, a business major. And now I actually work with the low income community to develop, you know, enterprises that serve people who come back from war, or something like that. And to me, that I inspired you to do that. I had no idea. Yeah. But when you see that something, you've planted a seed and that seed took life, right? That is really fulfilling to me. And it's also really fulfilling to me when students tell me, for example, when I taught at a large state school, I had students who were juniors in college who said that I was the first person who had taught them, who addressed them by their name, right? So just trying in a very large class in a state institution to know students' names.
Right.
And when I teach, I try to get students to tell me something, some kernel about their personal identity, because it reveals a little bit of what their journey is. And I think students sense when there's an openness of the gift and there's an openness to learn the topic, but there's an openness to like, what is this going to play out like in your life? That's why I love teaching.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if
I was just going to say that I think the dynamics of the gift are important to understanding teaching, but also responding to the problem of sacrifice that Higgins presents. But there's something, and this is a sort of very postmodern critique of the gift economy, right? Which is that, in order for there to be a gift, right, I have to, in a sense, reject the return of the gift. In other words, so if it's the holidays and I buy you a sweater and you buy me a sweater, it becomes exchange, right? It's no longer a gift, so that the one gift annuls the gift. So I bring that up only because in receiving those emails, right, does the reward or the return on the teaching annul the giftness of the teaching and turn it into exchange? Or must we sacrifice the return in order to maintain the giftness of the teaching?
Well, I would respond by saying, I'm just thinking out loud, that I would go back to our earlier critique that no, I don't believe in a kind of asceticism where I can't take joy in the fact that something I did in the classroom impacted a student. That sounds like the aesthetic sacrifice, work till I drop and I get no reward at all, right? Yeah. I think that that's wrong. And I think that that's why I loved the Higgins piece, because it points out that sometimes, we elevate people, that they're so selfless that they won't even receive a thank you. Whereas someone like McIntyre, who I heard you citing earlier when you mentioned, goods internal to practices, one of the things I think we've lost in our society is the ability to receive gifts from others, right? And so it takes, I would say there's a way to receive those emails from students with humility. And then maybe for me, to borrow a Jesuit phrase, since you're at a Jesuit school, right? Ad maiorem Dei gloriam, right? Yeah. Like, give the glory to God. Like, the fact that I impacted the student's life, let me thank God for the gift he gave me to be able to do that. And then it doesn't become about me. So I think with a nod to humility, we can accept those gifts.
Yeah, and I think that's another important piece, is that I wonder if Higgins sort of, I don't know if overstates the case is the right way of phrasing it, but the case that Higgins makes only makes sense in a world without God, right? So that, or maybe now I'm overstating the case, but it seems that, the sort of ascetic ideal, particularly of in Christianity that Nietzsche is critiquing and so on and so forth, that all of those sacrifices make sense precisely because we understand that there's a reward waiting, that God is trustworthy, right? And that we can participate in the divine and reap all of the joys of that. And that's why sacrifice is worthwhile. That's how it informs, the good life and the life worth living. But in a world where that doesn't exist, right? That all of, how we measure or self-sacrifice doesn't make sense because we must reject all sorts of rewards. So I don't know. I don't know if the sort of boogeyman that Higgins tries to sort of dismantle actually is a real one. You know what I mean? But anyway.
Yeah, well, I am so grateful that you introduced me to all these things, but I did want to ask, but maybe before we open it up to some questions from the students, I wanted to ask for people listening to this video now as well as later. I mean, this kind of teacher education that you're talking about sounds fantastic. How does one get it? So what are, just what are the opportunities that people have to develop themselves, whether through credential programs, professional development, books they should read? Like, what practical suggestions would you give to people who want to live out this idea of teaching as a vocation?
Well, my hope is that, that one pursues, if one has the goal of becoming a credentialed teacher, that one, takes seriously the opportunity that one can study the, education, or have opportunities to study education in a kind of humanistic way. And that, there are schools that offer, courses like philosophy of education, or, religion and education, and things like that. But I would say that, and I also write about this in my dissertation, that one of the sort of practical things that a teacher can do is what I call sort of canon formation, right? The idea that one can pursue conversations with a literary tradition in which the life of teaching is sort of at the center. And that can range from, the dialogues of Plato through, Montaigne, all the way up to the present day. That, in other words, a teacher's access to knowledge doesn't have to consist solely of the sort of social scientific sort in which, one takes information, knowledge, data, and then applies it to the classroom, but that one is part of a tradition of reflection on the ethical dimensions of the teaching life.
It was great. Thank you. That was great. Well, I would say that is probably why we connected so well when we met, because part of the reason that I founded Scala was precisely to bring these topics to more people. And what I've learned in the 4 years that I've been running Scala's programs is that it's not just people currently enrolled in school who care about these questions, people who are students, not just people in preparation to be teachers or professors, as important as it is, but in some ways, education and teaching is a vocation, and it's ongoing throughout our life. So you describe this kind of, people want to be formed philosophically and humanistically throughout their whole life. And a teacher may go through a teacher preparation program that prepares them in really important ways, as I did, but I still hungered for more of this humanistic formation. And so what I hear you saying is, if you're studying to be a teacher or professor, seek out the humanistically oriented teacher preparation programs. But no matter who you are, seek out a humanistic ongoing education to bring this ethos into whatever your practice is. Because the pursuit of knowledge, as you said, happens in formal traditional ways, but it happens through a lifelong encounter with these great ideas. And then we bring them into the world and we enter into this dynamic process where hopefully we're developing. And I say hopefully we're developing as opposed to languishing, because I think that the warning that I see, and this is also part of why I founded Scala, is that a lot of people do begin to burn out in ministries. Ministers are burning out, teachers, et cetera. So there's a need to continuously be formed even after the formal training.
Yeah.
But my hope is that more philosophy of education and more discussions on teaching as a vocation will be in all kinds of teacher training. But until such time, one can get it, and one should be getting it in a variety of different ways, like these webinars and a variety of activities you're involved in. So thank you. Thank you so much. This is a wonderful contribution to Scala's real desire to spread examples of exemplary educators and talk about liberal arts education in a variety of contexts, and open up questions about education as human formation and teaching as a process of self-sacrifice, self-gift, and human formation.